Welcome back to this read-along book club of Jeff Vandermeer's The Entire Southern Reach, but we're talking about authority right now. This is episode 8, I believe, and we're covering chapters 8 through 13. What developments have there been? Well, we find a very introspective, a very slow burn kind of plot unfolding before us as Control is unearthing certain things, you might say. Whitby continues to be weird and we get a little bit more enchaining, but let us begin with chapter 8. The terror. And we know that the terror migrates or transforms, one might say, into another word a little bit later on. But an hour or so later, it was time to visit the border. I'm so excited. It's funny, I had no memory of this whatsoever, but we get a very detailed glimpse at the border. But let us get there. Whitby faded into the background, disappearing through the doors with a conspicuous and sharp intake of breath, as if about to dive into a lake. He's just a really weird dude, and I love it. I thought I'd come up and spare you the dread gloves. Too expensive to remove them, and then it became a joke, or we made it into a joke, talking about these black gloves that Control noted earlier on. Whitby miraculously awaited them at the wheel of an idling army jeep. So, miraculously, interesting word choice there, isn't it? Had Whitby been a member of the drama club in college? Because he seems to be a very animated and again, odd individual. And here we go again with a rotting honey smell. But Control was hardly listening. He was wrinkling his nose at the unwelcome fact that the rotting honey smell had followed them into the Jeep. What is the smell? It is becoming a character in itself. But most Army personnel they passed were in camouflage, and it was hard for him to judge their numbers. So we're getting another detailed look about how the border is manned. What kind of firepower do they put there to prevent people from entering? Well, it gets even crazier when we talk about the entrance itself. We find out that the Army had been tasked with finding new entry points into Area X. They've been monitoring the edges for breaches, and nukes were locked in on Area X. That's a cool thing because I always wondered that. So right now, we have the satellite view, I guess, of Area X, and they're ready to nuke it. If anything goes wrong, they're blowing the shit up. So even though it's kind of blended into obscurity with the public, you can tell that the military, they still have their eye on this thing. Is this the route that the expedition would take to the border too? Control asked. Sure, Cheney said, but a special bus that doesn't need to stop. We used to joke that we ought to send them in with an abacus and a piece of flint, maybe a rubber band or two. Gallows humor, like in an ER. The endless ripple of scaly brown tree trunks, the smell of pine needles mixed with a pungent whiff of decay, and the exhaust from the Jeep, the blue-gray sky above, through the scattered canopy, the back of Whitby's swaying head. Whitby, invisible and yet all too visible, the cipher who came in and out of focus, seemed to both near and far. I think we're building up to something, ladies and gentlemen. Something about Whitby is going to go down. And one thing I'd like to point your attention to as well is that these scenes are kind of going back and forth. So it's documenting Control's journey to the actual border, but also going back and talking about conversations he's had at the Southern Reach, which brings us here. The terror, Whitby had said during the morning meeting, staring at the plant and the mouse. The terror, but oddly slurring it slightly. A name conveys a whole series of related associations, Sue had said. A set of related ideas, facts, etc., but also in the minds of other expedition members and thus accessible to whatever else might access them in Area X. Whereas biologists, that's a function, a subset of full identity. Not if you did it right, like Ghostbird, and you were totally and wholly your job to begin with. If you can be your function, then the theory is that these associations narrow or close down, and that closes down the pathways into personality, perhaps. But Control knew that wasn't the only reason to take away names. It was to strip personality away from the starker purpose of instilling loyalty and to make conditioning and hypnosis more effective. So we have two things right here. I've always thought, of course, stripping away someone's name and just giving them their function is stripping away their humanity. It's a psychological game. But also, the linguist, interestingly enough, is worried that language has power, or these names have power, and then perhaps Area X, knowing these names, has some kind of control or conduit into the other side. But James Lauer, the only other survivor of the first expedition, we keep hearing about him, and I really hope that he is one of the characters. I think he's one of the characters in the prequel Absolution. And the linguist continues. And by it, I mean whatever initiated these processes and perhaps used Saul Evans' words. Because our minds process information almost solely through analogy and categorization. We are often defeated when presented with something that fits no category and lies outside of the realm of our analogies. And I love how he ends each one of these scenes with more description of Area X. Gray moss clinging to trees, a hawk circling a clear-cut meadow under skies growing darker, a heat and humidity to the air that was trying to defeat the rush of wind past them. The Southern Reach called the last expedition the 12th. It was actually the 38th iteration, so we get a solid number right here, including 6 11th in quotes expeditions. And this is when we learn about the naming conventions and sort of the reasoning, even though it doesn't seem like there's much reasoning behind them. The 11th expedition series had been composed of all men, while the 12th, if it continued to XX.12.B and beyond, would continue to be composed of all women. But still, Control couldn't tell from his examination of the records that morning if the iterations had started as a clerical error. During the 5th, 2 Southern Reach had started lying to the participants. Grace had just shrugged when asked about the transition from X.11.K to X.12.A. The biologist knew about the 11th expedition because her husband was careless, so we moved on to the 12th. A lot of accommodations were made for the biologist, Control observed. The director ordered it. And this has always been at the corner of Control's mind and our mind. Why is the biologist special? I think we get that answer toward the end of this section of chapters. On a certain point on the way to the border, Control began to collect Shaneyism, so he's got all these weird sayings. A circle looks at a square and sees a badly made circle. As a physicist, what do you do when you're faced by something that doesn't care what you do and isn't affected by your actions? Then you start thinking about dark energy and you go a little nuts. How do you know if something is out of the ordinary when you don't know if your instruments would register the progressions? I guess it's kind of strange to practically live next to this, but then you go home and you're home. Black holes and waves have a similar texture, you know. There is some agreement among us now, reduced though we may be, that to analyze certain things, an object must allow itself to be analyzed, must agree to it. And we get a little bit deeper into this with the studies that go on in the cathedral-like facility. Control here prods him on the lies that the Southern Reach gave to the members of the expeditions. How do you feel about all the misinformation given to the expeditions? It isn't really misinformation. It's more like creating a story or a narrative to guide them through the narrows. An anchor, which going through the gate is pretty crazy, and so I can understand what Chaney's going on with here. Creating a narrative, though, I think I love that because it's planting a story in these people's minds to help them bridge the gap, face their fears into the unknown. But it kind of seems counterintuitive, but also they understand very little. Which brings us to chapter 9, evidence. What about the mouse, this plant? Grace conceded after a pause. She was trying to kill it. It wouldn't die. The assistant director made Whitby embark upon a summary of hair-raising attempts at destruction that included stabbings, careful burnings, deprivation of soil and water, introduction of parasites, general neglect, the emanation of hateful vibes, verbal and physical abuse, and much more. And here's more notes to Whitby's weirdness. Whitby reenacted some of these events with an overly manic energy. Whitby is straight out of a Lovecraft novel. He's going bonkers. Except someone had taken pity on the plant and watered it, perhaps even stuck in a dead mouse for some nutritional value. So someone was caring for it in this drawer. Now we are going to the samples rooms. A few miles from the border, the landscape changed. But before we do that, we're back on the border. A few miles from the border, the landscape changed. The dark pines and the patches of swamp gave way to a kind of subtropical rainforest. Control could see the curling question marks of fiddlehead ferns. That's such a great visual because we have a lot of questions. There's a lot of mysteries going on. They were, he realized, making their way along the periphery of a huge sinkhole. And more surprising still, white rabbits could be seen. Are those what I think they are? Yes, those are the true descendants of the experiment, the ones that got away. Control followed the progress of one white brute. There was something defiant in its stride. Are we going to have a monster rabbit on our hands? Whitby chimed in unexpectedly. Rabbits have 3 eyelids and can't vomit. You know, it's a good reminder to be humble. To be humbled, a humbling experience, something like that. What if some of them are returnees? Well, that would be bad. That would be sloppy. Because we know that they've spread fairly far, the ones savvy enough to survive. And it happens some of them have gotten out of the containment zone and been trapped by enterprising souls and sold to pet stores. Holy crap, so we have Area X rabbits on the loose. The few white and brown ones are the offspring of white rabbits mating with the native marsh rabbits. We call them border specials. And the soldiers shoot and eat them, but not the pure white ones, which I don't think makes sense. Why shoot any of them? Why not shoot all of them? Why eat any of them? Indeed. 50,000 samples languish in the long rooms that form the second floor of the left-hand side of the U. Jeff Vandermeer keeps giving us very specific descriptions of the locations of these places within the U-shaped building. And I regret not keeping track of it or perhaps creating a sketch of it. But someone on our Discord server is definitely sketching this out, so I can't wait to see it. So Control right now is actually wearing a version of these black gloves. The atmosphere was like that inside a cathedral. An ethereal heavenly music should have been playing. This isn't the first time we've had a cathedral-like mention. I think it was when the biologist was bearing, quote unquote, bearing the surveyor out to sea, right? I think she described the area as cathedral-like. But here, Control is envisioning this very cathedral-like as well, which, what does that say about him? This is my favorite place in the Southern Reach, Whitby told him. There's a sense of calm and safety here. Every kind of plant, pieces of bark, dragonflies, the freeze-dried carcasses of fox and muskrat, the dung of coyotes, a section from an old barrel. So all of these samples are displayed here. This would be so cool to see in a movie. But Expedition X.11.d showed no trace of human-created toxicity remained in Area X, not a single trace. So again, I think this is Vandermeer's fantasy. He's created this this zone, this area that basically is cleansing the world. No toxicity, no plastics, nothing like that. We learn a little bit later. Oh, here's kind of what Cheney was talking about earlier. So the gist of these comments was that when they looked away from the microscope, the samples changed. And when they stared again, what they looked at had reconstituted itself to appear normal. Desiccated beetle husks, brittle starfish, and other things in jars, bottles, beakers, and boxes of assorted sizes. This is such a crazy thing that Control asks. Has anyone ever tried to eat any of the samples? Shh, she said exactly as if they were in a church. Had Whitby sampled the samples? My guess is yes. Whitby is batshit crazy. He's got a purple electric car that we learn about later. But yeah, he's been eating some Area X business. Control had to bite his thumb to stop a giggle from escaping. He'd had a vision of the samples starting to dance behind that door, freed of the terrible limitations of the human gaze. So he's being exposed to weird things, but we rarely hear, or we rarely observe Control in this kind of way, having this kind of reaction, this kind of personality. So I thought that was interesting to note because we can see that all of this is starting to really affect Control. In the corridor afterward with Whitby, a little drained by the experience. Was that the room you wanted me to say? No, Whitby said, but did not elaborate. What is a secret room, Whitby? We must find it. But glimpses of towns now under the kudzu and other vines, moldering in the moss. Moldering is a word that Vandermeer uses often here. A long abandoned miniature golf course with a private theme. The golf greens had been buried in leaves and mud. I love how we have this kind of just tracking shot through the across the path to the border. We're kind of seeing how this has affected civilization outside of it. But we also spot a low ridge upon which sat a drab grain barracks, a more official-looking brick building for Army command and control, and the local Southern Reach outpost. And he describes these tents weird, like lemon meringue, which is to say it looked like any number of the churches Control had become familiar with in his teenage years. He also talks about moon pies. So we're talking about churches, we're talking about food. It's quite strange. We also learn about a border commander, Samantha Higgins. She was AWOL when they called on her. And then Control summons Whitby. We're flashing back to the office to have it out with him about the terror, in quotes, and talk about theories. Whitby had perched, another animalistic way of sitting in the chair, on the edge of the chair opposite Control and his huge desk, intent and waiting. He was almost vibrating like a tuning fork. Why did you say the terror earlier? And then you repeated it. Not terror. Not terror at all. Terroir. What is terroir then? A wine term. What does it mean? What does it mean? It means the specific characteristics of a place, the geography, geology, and climate that, in concert with the vine's own genetic propensities, can create a startling, deep, original vintage. And this really starts to burrow its way into Control's head, and he starts seeing the logic of Whitby finally when he's digging into the psychologist's paperwork. How does this apply to our work? Terroir's distinct translation is a sense of place, and what it means is the sum of the effects of a localized environment, inasmuch as they impact the qualities of a particular product. Yes, that can mean wine, but what if you applied these criteria to thinking about Area X? So you mean you would study everything about the history, natural and human, of that stretch of coast in addition to all other elements, and that you just might find an answer in that confluence. Exactly. The point of terroir is that no two areas are the same, and this isn't being done already. Some of it, just not all of it. Considered together, in my opinion, I feel there is an overemphasis on the lighthouse, the tower, base camp, etc., etc. So he thinks it's a bigger picture. It's not so much this focus that everybody seems to be concerned about. I can provide you with some of my personal findings. I can show you the start of things. Grand unified theories, Control notes, could backfire. The border had come down in the early morning on a date that no one outside of the Southern Reach remembered or commemorated, which killed an estimated 1,500 people, and there were no visual records of that entry point available to anyone. They were looking at the right side of a tall, sturdy red wooden frame. Here we are, right at the border, right at the entrance, that delineated the location, the width and height of the entrance beyond. If you went 10 feet beyond the line, the lasers from a hidden security system would activate and turn you into cooked meat. Even if you got here, you'd be screwed, because even if you got this far through all the military personnel and you decided, you know what, I'm crossing over an Area X, you'd get lasered. So they have a ton of protective measures right here. The entrance isn't visible from this side, Cheney says, but you'll see it soon. Doesn't it project light? Yes, but you can't see it from this side. The area had an aspect of a shrine, and the downpour cut off abruptly at the border, even though the landscape continued uninterrupted. I love this visual because we have the border and, it's storming, raining over here where Control and the rest of these guys are, but it's just cut off. Like it's this pure, pristine wilderness that is untouched. Beyond the red wooden frame, Control could see a roughly rectangular space forming an arch at the top, through which swirled a scintillating, questing white light, a light that fizzed and flickered and seemed always on the point of being snuffed out, but never was. So this is such a great view of Area X that I completely forgot about. Even though it's such a tall corridor and so wide, you have to crawl with your pack as close to the middle as possible, as far away from the sides as possible. No matter how you feel about enclosed or open spaces, it'll be strange in there, because you will feel simultaneously as if you are progressing across a wide open field and as if you're on a narrow precipice without guardrails and could fall off at any moment. So you exist in a confined and limitless space all at once. One reason we put the expedition members under hypnosis. So this is crazy. So it's a big ass entrance, but you have to lay down and crawl your way across, because you get this sensation of it's just endless, but also I'm going to fall off at any moment, which is an interesting thing to think about because Control has a stream of falling. It was like being in one of those aquariums with the water overhead, but murkier, so that I could not really tell what was swimming there, or it was the water that was murky, but instead the creatures. I saw constellations and everything was near and far all at once. There was a vast plain like where I grew up, and it just kept expanding and expanding until I had to look at the ground because I was getting the sense of being filled up until I would have burst. However, all of which could just as easily have occurred inside the subject's mind. So these are accounts of people who have experienced it and what they describe. But yeah, it could be a mental thing too. Control had found a relevant quote from James Lowry, our first expedition guy. The door, when I saw it, looked like it had always been there and would always be there, even if there was no Area X. Crazy. The director had apparently thought the border was advancing, but there was no evidence to support that view. So we also find out that the psychologist, or the ex-director, she had kind of alternative ideas as opposed to the Southern Reach, and she found that people weren't really going along with them, so she had to do her own experiments. Don't stare at it for too long, would be offered. It tends to draw you in. How did the members of the last 11th and 12th get out of Area X without being seen? There must have been an exit point we haven't been able to find. A secret door, perhaps? Why can't we see the corridor? Not sure what you mean. If it's visible, then we were meant to see it. That's a theory. It's definitely a theory, all right. I can't say it isn't. Staggering thought. What might come out into the world down a corridor 20 feet tall by 12 feet wide? All of this is giving me crazy cosmic horror vibes, and I am loving it. But while Control tried to stare down that sparkling, that dancing light, drawing him in. Which brings us to chapter 10, Fourth Breach. The terroir infiltrated his thoughts again, so it's burrowing. All these ideas are starting to mess with him, draw him further into Area X and the mysteries at the Southern Reach. When, late in the day, drying off, Control received the transcripts from his morning session with a biologist, the trip to the border kaleidoscoping through his head. Great word there. He retossed the mouse into the trash and repatriated the plant with the storage cathedral. Ghostbird's reference to the forest snail, which revealed she was quoting almost word for word from an old book by an obscure amateur parson naturalist. But he realized that she was just using that to describe him. Question: what did you leave at the empty lot? Answer: Leave? Like what? A necklace with a crucifix? Confession? And this is so cool because in this interview, Control starts opening up to the biologist, even though he's not really trusting her. He's frustrated with her answers because she seems to be incredibly stubborn and sarcastic, of course. But this is when he asks her, do you want to hear about my dreams? And he didn't know why he had said that to her. Of course, he's being hypnotized, you might say. And she calls him John. And it was the first time she'd used his name. So he did tell her his dream. It is a sudden image of information floating out the side of his head in a pixelated blood red mist. These are my relatives. This is my ex-girlfriend. My father was a sculptor. My mother is a spy. So it's this cool, that's such a cool visual. Pixelated blood red mist of all of his personal information just spilling out. But she relented too during the conversation for a moment. Answer. I woke in the empty lot and I thought I was dead. I thought I was in purgatory maybe, even though I don't believe in an afterlife. But it was quiet and so empty, so I waited there, afraid to leave, afraid there might be some reason I was meant to be there, not sure I wanted to know anything else. Then the police came for me, and the Southern Reach after that, but I still believed I wasn't really alive. Finally, we get something from the biologist. On the way back from the border, a silence had come over Control, Whitby, and Cheney. The companionable silence of shared experience. So they're all very affected by this. You know, there's a rumor about the former director in the border, that she went over the border by herself once. Just a rumor, though. No idea if it's true. Does this rumor include when this might have happened? Before the final 11th expedition. Have you ever been over the border, Cheney? No. Are you crazy? No. It gets back, and Control is having this moment of peace while he's in his car, but he notices something. Before that, he sees Whitby's purple electric car remaining at an angle across two spaces as if it washed up there. Such a great description, Vandermeer. And it's time to call the voice and file his report. And this is when Control notices something strange. It was the smallest thing. There was a squashed mosquito on the inside of his windshield. He knew it hadn't been there in the morning, and he knew he hadn't squashed it. And the voice says, I'll get you more information, and don't worry, I'm still working on the goddamn assistant director situation. Call me tomorrow. Control contemplated the tangled geometry of blood and delicate limbs. Such a cool way to describe a dead mosquito. He couldn't stop staring at the mosquito, very similarly to the entrance of Area X. Which brings us to Chapter 11, the sixth breach. At home, Troy waited on the steps, so we are back in a cozy rental in Headley. And Cheney admits that the director wasn't quite on the same team as everybody else. I never had the idea that the director agreed with us much, you know. And he also finds that he has a malfunctioning phone from the director's desk in addition to his other two personal phones. And this is a cool revelation that comes to him as he's watching TV. But the gist had been that institutions, even individual departments and governments, were the concrete embodiments of not just ideas or opinions, but also of attitudes and emotions. And yet, as Grace had said, once he became too comfortable within the Southern Reach, once he was cocooned by its embrace, he would be too indoctrinated to perceive it. Indoctrinated, more kind of, religious talk, you might say. Which brings us to Chapter 12, Sort of Sorting. It's a sort of sorting. In the morning back at work, he discovered that a fluorescent rod had burned out in his office, dulling the light. So it's getting a very gloomy atmosphere. And he finds his document, Terroir and Area X, a complete approach by Mr. Whitby. And he also has an appointment on Friday to view the videos from the first expedition. Exciting. And Control can't help himself. He goes to the door, he opens it with the words written behind it, and he paints over all of it. And he also takes two of his father's carvings, a tiny red rooster and a moon blue goat that came from a series entitled simply Mi Familia, and he places them on his desk, but he also puts little cameras, right, or bugs on them. And chess, we find out, was something that he and his father played because he wasn't able to play pool anymore because of his health, but he put the rooster on the far left corner of his desk and the goat on the right. He had glued to each a nearly invisible nano camera. He was then free to consider the director's notes. So he's sitting here on a stool in his office, listening to his favorite neoclassical composer playing on his laptop, and these files he finds detailed all of the director's official memos and reports. Director files DMP of major and minor memos and reports. But there's all kinds of things. There's receipts, indicated straggler items, not quite a formal outing of groceries, roll of paper towels, beef jerky, all kinds of weird stuff she's buying. But what if the seemingly random surfaces on which the director had written her notes had significance? This is full-on conspiracy theory. You can tell this place is really getting to him. But then he logically determines that no, the director's vast array of textures reveals only, in quotes, that she had been absorbed in her task. So rather than stopping and making this, official documentation, she's writing on anything that's around her. She had no siblings and had grown up with her father in the Midwest. She had studied psychology at a state college, been a consultant for about 5 years. This is the psychologist, of course. She liked to dine alone, but once the receipt from the barbecue place had 2 dinner orders on it, company? Perhaps, like him, she sometimes ordered food to go so she'd have a lunch for the next day. And Control is in there painstakingly separating one page from another. The layers continue to support that the director liked both nature and a cold breakfast. And he finds one titled Review Transcripts from X.10.C, especially Anthro on LH Landing. Recommend discontinuing use of black boxes for conditioning purposes. He finds bizarrely printed on a dot matrix paper despite a date of only 18 months ago a note on the 12th expedition. The director called the surveyor someone with a strong sense of reality, a good bracing foil to the others, useful but not essential, possibly a dangerous addition, a sympathetic but narrow character who might deflect attention. But this is the cool part. When he finds the note on the biologist was the most extensive, not a very good biologist in a traditional sense, empathetic more toward environments than people, forgets the reason she went, who is paying her salary, but becomes embedded to an extraordinary extent, would know Area X better than I do from almost the first moment sets foot there, experience with similar settings, self-sufficient, unburdened, connection through her husband. What would she be in Area X? A signal, a flare, or invisible exploit? Definitely. So we know this from reading Annihilation. All of this is true. And so the psychologist is thinking she is going to be a useful tool, conduit, a signal, a flare, who knows? But anyway, it's probably her best bet to get maybe the truth out of Area X. He notes more of the psychologist thinking here that if your supervisors and colleagues did not agree with your assessment, you might come up with an alternative plan and begin to enact it on your own, which is exactly what the psychologist has done. I like the end of this chapter because we remember that Control moved everything out, but it took him so much effort to navigate that he wondered if he'd subconsciously been trying to keep something out. Which brings us to the final chapter of this section. 13, recommendations. So Grace Stevenson, Homo sapiens, female, family originally from the West Indies. So this is funny. He goes in, he's going to talk with the assistant director, and he's just categorizing her. He's being very robotic, which again is more illuminating to Control's thought processes, but dual degrees in political science and history. Grace Stevenson had entered a kind of holding pattern, so when she gets here, she's stagnating, you might say. Her arm in arm with the director. The director was a big woman. He finds a photo here at a company picnic. Such a weird thing, and he notes it as well, that the Southern Reach would have these picnics because of what they're studying. It's such a strange thing to sort of compartmentalize this weirdness, this world-altering, world-threatening thing, and then also having a summer picnic. Finally, he sits down opposite Grace, and they have this conversation. And Grace attacks him with, let me get to the point. Someone has been interfering with my access to Central this week, but whoever is doing you this favor has no tact, or whatever faction being a key word, is behind it doesn't have quite enough pull. I don't know what you're talking about. Could his mother be heading up this faction? It's a possibility. Then in that case, John Rodriguez, I have no comments on your recommendations, except to say that I will begin to implement them in as excruciatingly slow a fashion as possible. You should begin to see a few of them, like buy a new floor cleaner in place by next quarter. Possibly. Maybe. So she is firing back at his list of recommendations for the Southern Reach. And she opens a drawer, and pulls out a mother of pearl jewelry box. Do you know what this is? A jewelry box? This is a box full of accusations. And then she opens it, sending a handful of bugs Control recognized all too well. The rotting honey smell had intensified again. Why would I bug you? You did. You also rifled through my files, looked in all my drawers. No, I didn't. But this time his anger was backed by something real. He hadn't ransacked her office, only placed the bugs there. If you do it again, I'll file a complaint. Did you put the director's cell phone in my satchel? Did you squash a mosquito in my car? What are you talking about? But rather than respond, Control got up, retreated into the corridor, not sure if he heard laughter from behind him or some distorted echo through the overhead vent. What is going on, guys? So we get a great look at the border. We get a great look at the entrance. We see Whitby getting crazier and crazier. We see all of this stuff compounding around Control, affecting his thought processes even. He finds all these documents, or he goes through all these documents from the psychologists, trying to piece it together. And someone must be spying with him and squashing mosquitoes in his car. It gets crazier and crazier. This is a very, very slow burn, but I'm enjoying it thoroughly. Let me know what you're thinking about. But let's talk about the next section we're going to read. So we're going to start on 14, and I say we just end. Let's go all the way through 18. So we'll begin at Hauntings for the next one. So I'm assuming this is going to end in some kind of arc, because we are going to enter a new section. So I look forward to reading it with you. Let me know all of your thoughts. If I missed anything, down below in the comments, or hell, join our Discord. We're having a chat as well. Thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out with me and reading along with me, and I will see you guys in the next video.